Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our Quick Turn PCBs Why and Experience Supply Chain Matters webinar. My name is Ed McMahon. I'm the CEO here at Epic. Before we get started, just want to let you all know that everybody will be muted during the presentation. So if you have any questions as we move along, go ahead and just put them in the questions panel located in the webinar control, and then we will try to get to all of them at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time to go through all the questions, we will be sure to reply back to you by email. This recording, we'll be recording this webinar, and it'll be posted on both the slide deck and on our website and on the YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So our agenda today is really to talk about the specific parts of the different printed circuit board technologies and how they all affect your delivery. A couple of months ago, we did a webinar that was on the cost side of it, and then we've been asked a lot since then to do another one that talks a little bit about the lead time and really kind of help people understand the reasons why things take a little bit longer. And again, that's what really our objective is here, is to help our customers, regardless of who's building their PCBs, really understand what they're getting into when they're designing a printed circuit board a certain way and how it's going to affect whether or not it can be delivered, and by giving everybody the questions to ask of the fabricator that they're using before they go ahead and get into a situation where you're not going to be successful with the delivery that you need. And especially because this industry now is so big, and the majority of the parts, everybody thinks quick turns, oh, those are all being made domestically. Well, a lot of times, if you 5 days and greater on a lead time, a lot of those parts are being made in Asia, because you can have the parts built in 3, and if your supply chain is good, you can have it here in 2 and ship on the 5th day. So that's going to be the objective here today, is to have everybody walk away really understanding all the questions they need to ask when they're working with a fabricator, so that they can ensure that not only is their target's going to be hit, but many times the delivery target is even more important than the cost side of it. So the first thing is that not all printed circuit boards are the same, right? And design complexity matters just as much in delivery as it does on the cost side of it. And everybody knows that every company says they can do everything. I can do a 1-day, 2-day, and 3-day turn, no problem. 5-day, sure. 10-day, no problem. But the reality is that without understanding the design, you really can't comment on delivery, right? I mean, if you're looking at the part that's there to the left where it's got selectively plated up 5 ounces of copper, there's no possible physical way that can be done in 5 days. Right? If you look at that little part over there to the right, you think, well, that's a really simple little part, or it shouldn't be that big of a deal. Well, it has got staggered gold-plated fingers on it, and it's got a chamfer that has to be done a certain way. So there's no physical way that those boards can be done in 2 days, regardless of, if you wanted one panel, maybe. If you wanted, typically in this situation for these connectors, those are usually in the thousands that we do quick turns on. So the whole idea is really understanding how the different PCBs that you're looking for are going to require a little bit more time, and it'll help our customers plan so that they don't get themselves behind the 8 ball. So one of the things that we talked about in our design thing are the via types, right? Because obviously via types, the different types of vias will add cost to your board, but they also add time. Right? A lot of times when you think about things like blind and buried and micro vias, it adds time, not only because you may have to either outsource, right? Do you have to outsource laser drilling, which a lot of companies do? Well, it's really hard to do a 3-day turn when you're having to outsource the micro via outside drilling, and you're going to lose 2 days, 1 day shipping there, 1 day shipping back. Right, so that's kind of why these things matter. Now, if you just had plated through holes, it doesn't have to go anywhere. But if you have buried micro vias, that's really a different animal, and it's really understanding how that's going to affect your lead time issues. If you go back to doing buried or blind or micro vias where you have different lamination cycles, this is the one thing to keep in mind, right? If you look at this PCB flow chart, right? This is a basic understanding of what printed circuit boards go through. For every single lamination cycle that you do, whether it's because it's a hybrid, whether it's because it's got blind and buried vias, regardless of what it is, if it's flex and rigid flex, whatever it is, it's got to go past this every single time. So basically, if you've got a printed circuit board that's got 3 lamination cycles, it's got to go through the entire board making process 75% of the time, 3 times, right? 75% of the process it has to go through 3 times. So this particular board versus a board that only has to go through one lamination cycle, you can imagine why the time is a lot less, and it could go through a lot quicker. And that's why, without knowing your design and understanding all of the parameters of it, it's really hard to say, yes, I can do a 2-day turn, or I can do a 7-day turn, without really understanding not only the complexity, but the quantities that you're talking about too, right? If you've got a 2-panel job, it's a whole lot easier to being able to go through these processes than a 50-panel job, right? Because you're basically taking 50 panels and you're running those panels through 3 times, almost the entire process, which takes an awful lot of time in your shop. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's not something that you can just go ahead and rush through, right? The lamination cycle between the hot and the cold press, it's got to stay in there for at least 2 hours in terms of the hot and cold, and many times it has to stay in longer. And you can't just heat it up faster, you can't just try to cool it down faster. A lot of these processes take the amount of time that they take. And plating is another one, especially when you're talking about real high reliability parts where you need to have a minimum amount of thickness in the holes. There's nothing you can do to speed that process up. It just has to go through it. So you're dealing with physics, which is why it will take a lot longer to run a board with 3 lamination cycles than it does with 1. One of the things to keep in mind when you're talking about blind and buried vias is that they're not all the same, right? Because for this particular one is that if you have this particular part, you're going to actually go through 3 different lamination cycles, where a standard 6-layer you go through 1. But depending upon how you build this, a lot of times there's a lot of tricks that you can do. However, one of the things that we need to understand as a fabricator is if we can start looking at this well before you send us an order, we're going to have a lot more effective ways to put strategies in place and maybe give you some suggestions to keep you from potentially making a decision that's going to add lead time to it. And there are things like blind vias and micro vias and putting them on different layers that give us a fighting chance, right? If you put blind vias that originate on outer layers, that gives us a whole lot more opportunity to move quicker than if you put them on inner layers, right? So us having a discussion about where you're actually going to place these features on your board will actually help on the delivery, right? Because when you look at a board like this, if all this did was have the blind vias on the outer layers, then it's 1 lamination cycle. And we're just controlled depth laser drilling the blind vias, and we're taking out the whole 2 other lamination cycles. So when you're talking about the difference between being able to deliver in 3 days and 7 days, that is really a big part of what could be the determining factor. So really working with your fabricator early on, talking about what you're trying to get accomplished can help us be able to ensure that we can deliver a lot faster. One of the other things that most companies don't recognize that add a substantial amount of time are filling vias. And the whole thought process is on the picture on the right there is where most customers would like to see how they want to see the vias filled. They want to see them filled completely, no voids, no air bubbles, and then plated over the top. And it's very, very easy to do that if it's done properly. The challenge becomes is that that's another one of these processes that takes a whole lot more time than anybody recognizes. If it was nothing more than just trying to squeeze the material down through the vias and being done with it, that would be one thing. However, you have to start by pre-baking the material. Many times it's over an hour to get the material to the temperature so that the laminate to the temperature, so that the material will flow through, right? So you have to make sure that it sits in many times an hour, if not two, in an oven, so that you get the consistent temperature throughout the entire laminate. Right, you can't just throw it in at 700 degrees, leave it for 10 minutes, and think that the whole laminate is going to be the same temperature all the way through. So now you've got to do that just before you do it. Now it's got to come right out. It's got to go right into fill, right? And then it's got to go into cure, and that's the same thing, right? That's got to sit for at least an hour, if not more, right? So you're adding a substantial amount of time when you're talking about filling vias to just physically being able to get the parts out in time. And again, one panel job, probably not as bad. A 50 panel job, and you're trying to deliver that in 5 days, I mean, this could add 8 to 10 hours to the entire process, right? So this is one of those things that takes an awful lot of time. One of the ways around that is a lot of times is that we work with the customers to reduce the overall size of the filled via, and then we can plate it shut. That takes away this whole process. Does it take a little bit longer in plating? Yes, but it takes a lot less time than it does to properly fill and cure these filled vias. One of the other things that takes a lot of time, especially, are what we call hybrids, these cavities, and things like air pockets. If you look at the cavities in the top right, one of the things around there from a lead time perspective is that a lot of times there's really tight tolerance machining that's required, especially because we have to use what's called a no-flow pre-preg, and we have to create a pattern that fits perfectly underneath the outer layers to go through lamination. Well, that is a wildly time-consuming process. Right, so really with this type of stuff, if we're having to meet this specification, it just adds to the amount of time. Not every printed circuit board fabricator has CNC machining equipment in-house, and typical routers that are used in printed circuit boards are not the same as what you'd see at a CNC shop. And then a lot of times when you talk about hybrids, like the picture down on the bottom right, what you're talking about there is, while it's through whole vias, through the whole thing, it requires 2 lamination cycles because of the fact that the pre-preg that you got to use to laminate that top layer of taconic material to that second layer of FR4 is different. And so if you were to try to put the whole stack up into one lamination cycle, you would have to get to a temperature and a time that would do damage to some of the other parts of the board. So it creates 2 lamination cycles, which creates additional time for us as a fabricator. And then next thing to really talk about is really understanding what your fabricator's capability are, because they're not all the same, right? And traditionally, most printed circuit board folks can say they can do a little bit of everything, because technically the majority of the equipment used to manufacture printed circuit boards is pretty much the same. There are different levels depending upon the technology that you're doing, but traditionally, if you could make a double-sided board or a 4-layer board, you could technically manufacture a 16-layer board. But really, it's about understanding what your fabricator has to be able to determine if, in fact, not only can they do it technically, but can they do it in the time that you're looking for to ensure that you get what it is that you want. So one of the big things is around engineering, right? And this is something that really makes a ton of sense, because if you think about it, every new job has to go through CAM at a fabricator, right? And a lot of things have been happening lately, and a lot of times a lot of fabricators in the U.S. especially will outsource their CAM work to places like India and in other countries in China, or in Asia, excuse me. But the reality is that if you do that, a lot of times what happens is that you lose time, right? If you can't commit to getting a full list of technical questions to the customer within 2 hours of submitting a 5-day turn, you really have no chance of hitting that 5-day turn, right? And everybody's been involved in a situation where a fabricator kind of uses technical questions to add delivery time to them because technically the clock doesn't start until all the TQs are answered, right? And one of the things about fabricators that most of us really want to do is we want to do a design for manufacturing review for free while you're in the design process. I don't care if we have to do it 5 times, but at least we'll know and you'll answer those TQs before you ever submit an order, so that by the time you finalize your design, 95% of what any technical questions would have been there are now done. And we can move right on and move quickly. Because if we can't get out of engineering on a 3-day turn within 2 hours and get into imaging, we're going to be late. It's just that there's just no physical way to do it. We have to be able to move that quickly. And that's why working with a fabricator who really wants to be involved in your design and is willing to invest in the CAM resources to do free DFM work for you is really important. The second big thing is, what processes do they outsource, right? Very few manufacturers have everything in-house. Very few do, right? And especially, recently, as new technologies have come into place, things like AnyPig, it's really expensive to put that process in, and it tends to plate itself out if it's not used on a daily basis. Hard gold is one that not a lot of people have just because of the sheer investment in the chemistry to actually be able to do it. And a lot of customers or a lot of fabricators are even getting out of the leaded hassle business because of the fact that it's just not used as much anymore. And even some of the lead-free hassle, a lot of fabricators didn't bring it in-house because some of the times the compatibility with other chemistries wasn't great. But a lot of people outsource. And without knowing the design, saying they can do something in 3 days, without knowing they got to go outside because you want copper fill in your vias, well, that's 2 days right there. So how possibly are they going to do 5 when they got to ship to California? And interestingly, domestically, there are certain pockets in Southern California, there's 4 printed circuit board shops within a 2-mile radius of somebody who does nothing but a lot of surface finishes. So these guys use this, and it doesn't add any time. But if you're in Texas and you've got to send these panels to California to get an outsourced process, that's going to cause a delay. And typically, we'd only worry about the delay of the processing itself. With today's market, you also worry about the transportation, and we'll get to that in a little bit. When you're talking about Asia, especially in Taiwan, it's really not that uncommon to have really small shops that have only part of the process, and then they use minivans and they run product around to many different places to do a lot of the different processes, right? And that's not uncommon. That's how they built their business. And there's a lot of companies that do that, and they can produce really good product. The challenge is that you run into a major issue, not only because of a control, but a scheduling, right? If you happen to get to your subcontractor 5 minutes after they got a 250 panel order, you could be now losing 8 or 9 hours that you needed to match your lead time, especially on quick turns, right? So that is really one of the things to understand, especially in Asia. What processes do you outsource, and what critical processes to the design that you're sending in are going to require that they go outside? And where is this place, and how much pull do they have there? How much leverage do they have to be able to make sure that your stuff gets done first? One of the other things is, how big is the fabricator, right? Because the reality is that it matters for a couple of different reasons, right? One is that the larger companies get a little bit more pull, especially when it comes to laminate, right? Not only is the laminate availability critical for delivery, but the laminate cost is a lot different when you're buying that much in volume, right? And can they get the technical support that they need from their suppliers? If you're working with a chemistry supplier, or if you're working with somebody from embedded resistors, do you do enough work to get their guys to help when there's a technical challenge? Or when a customer has some questions that they want to try to get answered, can they get the help that they need because they're big enough, right? And then have they invested in the right in equipment, both new and backup? If you've got a critical piece of equipment like a plasma de-smear unit, and it goes down, and now you got to send everything to California to be hole prepped and surface prepped, that is a huge delay, and one that even if it's only down for a day, can be a problem. I mean, one of the things that we've seen recently here is in China, especially right now, there's a national 5G rollout, right? So the majority of the laminate is going towards people working on that. And so a lot of the smaller shops are really having trouble getting laminate, and they're having to pay cash in advance, which is also changing how they work with their customers as well. One of the things that we've seen, especially recently, is a lot of smaller companies who are doing brokering from smaller PCB factories in Asia. And the real thing is, how many U.S. employees do they have, right? Because having somebody out of a garage, while that person may be strong, that doesn't give you a lot of resources. It doesn't give you a lot of financial resources if there's a quality problem. But if you're talking about really high density boards that you're looking at, and you're going to put 30 grand worth of components on it, and there's an interlayer problem that nobody was able to see until they're populated, you really need somebody behind you that's going to be able to support a claim like that. And that's why having somebody who has some resources is really critical. And along with that, a lot of people say they've got people on the ground. Well, do they? Or do they pay somebody who gets paid by 30 people, and that if you've got a problem with your part, that guy will be over there in 2 weeks to see what the issue is? Or do they have people right at the factory that can send you pictures every night of where your parts are to ensure that they're getting through the processes as fast as they need to, and you can rest assured that you're not being told something that isn't true? And then what's the logistics strategy? That's really important, especially today. Shipping not only from Asia, but domestically has really become a challenge. And do they have the leverage with suppliers to help you get what you need? One of the things that we're going to talk about here is the transportation side of it, because most of the fabricators can make parts in 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 days pretty easily. But if those completed boards sit on a tarmac for a week, that doesn't help you, right? And the reality is that there's some facts, right? So 65% of all small package, which is basically what PCBs focus on, right? PCBs, especially on the quick turn side, they fall into the small package arena. And they used to be 65% of them be on passenger aircraft, right? Well, we all know, based upon COVID, that passenger flights are down 85%. So the capacity has reduced by over half, right? And one of the things that you want to work with somebody who's big enough so they can get guaranteed weight on planes every single day. And so if there's a problem with a shipment, they're not sitting on the UPS or FedEx 1-800 number and just talking through, waiting for somebody who doesn't know them to get them an answer, right? You need to have somebody, because we've seen it. We've seen it over the past 2 months. Boards from customers that are just sitting and they're not moving, and they're sitting on the tarmac in Hong Kong, and they're getting rained on, and then they're getting to the customer and they're unusable. It's not the printed circuit board shop's fault. They did what they were supposed to do. But from a transportation perspective, it's becoming wildly difficult. One of the other issues on transportation that you're starting to see is that the big guys, UPS, FedEx, and DHL, are now adding $2 to 90 cents a pound surcharge on freight. So it's one of those other things that you need to, because they're not going to tell you until you get your invoice, what we've seen a lot of, right? And the reality is that at least with people like UPS and FedEx, they've got their own flights. Some DHL do as well. But a lot of the other freight brokers who also have these surcharges, they're really just looking to buy open space. And it used to be a really good business when there was a lot of open space. Well, there's not now. So it's really important to understand how the logistics are going to work, because if your quick turn is done, but it can't get out of the country, it really doesn't help you. One of the things that we want to talk about in the USA, and we had the folks from UPS in here yesterday. The other thing to remember when you're looking at quick turns, and normally with the quick turns, our customers aren't using ground shipment when they want a quick turn, right? They use their red. Part of the challenge right now is that if you try to ship ground, even if you're traditionally in a one-day delivery from ground from your fabricator, it could take up to 5, right? UPS and FedEx is reporting that they're 20% more volume than typical peak season, which is the Christmas season, 20% more volume with this whole COVID stuff now than they are during peak season. So they're just getting clobbered, right? And so if you go ground, you're going to be put, they're not going to intentionally delay, but they know that their guarantee is technically 3 to 5 days. They're going to maybe use all 5 of them. And the other thing to think about is letting your supplier manage your freight. Right? So with someone like us, where we spend $4 million a year with UPS. So if we have a problem, we can get really high up the organization really fast. But if a customer puts it on their UPS number, we can't really help them because it's not our number. But if we do the shipping, we charge you for the shipping, our costs will usually be less, and more importantly, when you have a problem, you don't have to worry about trying to work through the UPS system. It's call us or call your supplier and let them do it. And there's a lot of suppliers out there like us that have the same thing. So we're not unique there specifically, but we want to be the one that does that, because now we're in more control and be able to help you, because we're just helpless. When you give us your freight account, we ship it out to you, and then it's delayed. There really isn't anything that we can do. The other thing on the delivery is materials, and everybody now knows, everybody's familiar with all the different great materials that are out there. It's creating huge opportunities for creating high-speed electronics, and those things are great. But with all of these come a challenge, right? And delivery is probably the biggest challenge when it comes to materials, right? One of the ways to do this is to work with your fabricator, right? Because there's a couple ways to do this, right? One, we can stack it for you. If you say, listen, I'm going to use this specific Rogers, and it's a 20 sheet minimum order, but I'm going to use it over the year, we'll buy it. Most fabricators will buy it and put it on the shelf, right? Otherwise, you may be 8 to 12 weeks if they're out, right? That, especially with Rogers, 2 ounces in copper or greater right now is another one where, if the laminate manufacturers make a whole lot more money making half ounce than they do 4. So they want to make more half ounce. So they don't have a lot of 4 ounce. But if you work with somebody who's got a lot of customers in that realm, you're going to be a lot better chance of not being delayed by laminate. Non-standard thicknesses, right? Again, if you're running a non-standard thickness, that could be 2 to 3 to 4 weeks. Anybody who's been working with DuPont's flex material these days knows that it's can be up to 12. That's something that we're seeing a lot of. One of the things that we're working with customers on now is, as part of your delivery or your stack up, if you specify and call out the impedance values that you want, it gives us a lot more options than if you just specify the dielectrics. If you specify the dielectrics and say we can't deviate from that because it's going to get you to a certain point, well, that's great. But the challenge becomes is now you've limited what we can get and how quickly we can deliver in some instances, right? So that is really something that we like to work with on. Tell us what you want on the impedance side, and we'll tell you how we can get there and how we can deliver the quickest. Another thing is that there's more than one option. Isolo's come out with a new high-speed offering that is really competitive with Rogers in terms of their values, everything from DK to the way that they're doing the cross weaves, and they're more readily available. So there's a lot of different options out there now that many of our customers aren't even aware of. And even on some of the laminates that are manufactured in Asia, they've come out with some new high-speed product that is a lot more available. So that's one way to work with your fabricator to ask them what other options that are out there. And the last one is let the fabricator make the laminate. Many instances, what we will do is if it's for a small run, rather than, if it's a specified, a non-standard thickness, we can just go ahead and make it, right? We'll go ahead and in our press using pre-preg, we'll make the laminate. Now, not all customers want that. It's pretty much, it's 99% the exact same thing you would get from the manufacturer, but it is a little different. But we can do it. And from a fit, form, and function perspective, it is absolutely the same thing. So in many instances, fabricators will come to the customer and say, we'll go ahead and just make it so we can get you out of this delivery pinch and get quickly into production. Want to talk just for a second about rigid flex PCBs, because when you talk about flex and rigid flex versus traditional rigid, right? Rigid boards, everybody's pretty comfortable 1, 2, 3, 5 days, right? Everybody from most standard product can deliver that, and that's not an issue. However, on flex and rigid flex, that's usually 7 to 10, right? And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? One of them is the multiple lamination cycles that we've talked about. Two is, we're using smaller panel sizes, so it's a lot more processing, right? Because we're using 12 by 18 panels because of registration, where we're using 18 by 24 or sometimes bigger on rigid. A lot of laser cutting and or drilling, right? Especially on the rigid portions of it. We need to pre-cut, no-flow pre-preg. So and when you have to put stiffeners and PSAs on it, you're just adding a lot of time that you don't see to go on top of the rigid side of it. 2 items to help, okay, when you're looking for quick turn, all right? Number 1 is Echo Bond. If you're looking at Echo Bond on your where the flex and the rigid part come together, you're better off on a quick turn to either try to do it yourself or minimize the specification, because it's really time sensitive when you got to do that by hand. And then second thing is stiffeners. One of the things around stiffeners is that the majority of them for us have to go through a lamination cycle. So what we do is we make the stiffeners separately out of whatever material that they are, and then we go ahead and we cut no-flow pre-preg again and a fixture, because the whole thing has to sit flat, and then it goes into a lamination press for a full lamination cycle. So as you can imagine, that's a lot different than if we could take a 3M pressure-sensitive adhesive and attach the stiffener that way. In many instances, that works for especially quick turns, and it takes a lot of time out of the process. So using PSAs instead of us going back through a lamination cycle helps with our delivery time. Quality inspection and how it matters towards the lead time on quick turns, right? As everybody knows, from an IPC standard, Class 2 is the baseline, and pretty much everybody in the world is making their parts to Class 2. If we have to go to Class 3 or mil spec, it's not the same as doing a Class 2 board for lots of different reasons, right? Especially the number one reason is yield, right? You now have to have specific coupons that are on production panels, right? So now, instead of what could be a 5-panel job, it could be a 10, based upon where I have to put the coupons. And then secondly, you got minimums on plating thickness and annular ring, right? So the parts have to stay in the plating tanks longer. We have to go through a much more rigorous CAM process to make sure that we can get that 1 mil annular ring minimum, right? And then we've got a lot more inspection to do. So there's a lot of things on those that are going to add time to it. And the real question we ask customers on a Class 3 on a quick turn is, do you really need it? If you really need it, we can do it. We'll do the best we can. But if you don't, we can move a lot faster. And we can have you something quicker. And then when you get into production, we can go to that Class 3 and that next step to do that all out the right way. The other thing on a quick turn that really from an aerospace especially is a big one is the AS9100, right? If you look at the AS9100, a lot of the reporting work is really redundant, and it's really stuff that has nothing to do with the fit, form, and function. So what we work with, is it really needed for this quick turn? And is it really needed for the quick turn, or can we send the AS9100 report afterwards? When you look at it, the majority, we're gonna do the quality stuff on all the critical dimensions, absolutely on every part. But as far as the notes, and a lot of the notes on a lot of these parts can be 50 to 100. Like, are they wrapped in the right packaging? Do I really need to have that when you have the boards, or can I get that to you 2 days later, right? Because that, from a quick turn perspective, affects how I'm going to be able to get you the parts. If I got to go through and I got to do a complete AS9100 report before I send it to you. All right, just as we end up here, just some additional resources. You can look on our website. We've got some really good content that we place there. We're really happy that we actually just passed on our blog 8,000 email subscribers that are there. We're continuing to put up more and more resources all the time, so please take a look at all of the different resources that we have available to you. So in summary, design choices factor into not only the cost, but the delivery more than you think, right? And when your delivery is the most important thing, you can make it easier, right? And you can let us help you, because working with your fabricator early is critical, not only from a cost perspective, but for a delivery perspective. And there are a lot of things that we can do to help you well before that PO is cut, that'll allow you to get you what you need so that you're not scrambling when your fabricator doesn't meet the delivery that you need. It's important that you get your fabricator involved. There's a whole lot more, there's a whole lot of smart people in this business all throughout this country that can help get you what you need if you let them. All right, really quick, our team's going to review the questions that came in. I'm just going to briefly just show this to you, some of the other products that we do. You know, we've been in business now for well over 60 years. Many of you work with us on a lot of these different products, and we appreciate that. As you can see, we started in printed circuit boards, and that's really what everything's based upon, so we appreciate everybody's continued support. All right, questions. We'll take this first one here. What is the easiest way to find out if there are other more readily available laminates for my PCB design? So one of the things that we work with our customers on, if you've got a laminate that you built your design on and you're finding that you're struggling to get the laminate, what we ask you to do is you send us the data sheet and you highlight the specific characteristics of that data sheet that are most important to you, whether it's the DK or whatever value it is. Once we get that data sheet from you, we will then go through and look through all the other options, and we can send you back the data sheets on similar materials that will allow you to then fire their values into your calculations to help you figure out if they're going to be available or not. But that's the easiest way. On our website and on all the PCB laminate manufacturers' websites, you can get those data sheets. They're available. And if you can't, you can contact your fabricator, and we can certainly get you one. The next question is, does the number of layers add significantly to the lead time? So what's interesting is that it used to be yes, right? When you added a different layer inside of if you went from a 12 layer to a 16 layer board, that ended up being a bunch of time. You had to do silver films for each one. You had to go through AOI. You had to go through AOI the films, especially if it was a tight job. You had to go through quality. You had to image them all. But with things like laser direct imaging now, where you're only going to be, if it's only a 4-panel job and you're adding really 4 more layers, that's just 4 more images. And when it's coming right out of the LDI, it's really not adding a ton more time. It's really minuscule. You may add a little bit more time at the electrical test side because you're adding some more nets, but technically going from a 12 to 16 layer really isn't adding a whole lot more time from our perspective. Right, so if you need to add some more layers to get what you want, don't worry about adding the time. Once you're into the 8, 10, 12 layers, adding 2 more or 4 more, as long as there's not blind and bearings associated with it, you're really not going to add any more time for us or any more time that's any significant. All right. Well, thank you all for taking the time today. We appreciate your continued support. For the balance of these questions, we will go ahead and get this list out to everybody. We'll answer your questions via email. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. Thank you again for joining us today.